They laughed at him like he was a clown who had wandered onto the wrong stage. One man even whispered loud enough for the entire row to hear, "Money can't buy class." That was the moment Malcolm Green realized the room wasn't laughing at a mistake or a clumsy gesture. They were laughing at him, a black man daring to stand proud in a space they had already decided didn't belong to him. His son's name had just been called, the auditorium vibrating with polite applause, and for a flicker of a second Malcolm's chest had swelled with the warmth only a father could know. But then the silence, then the smirk of the principal, then the calculated pause before pronouncing his son's name incorrectly. Deliberately wrong. Drawn out like a joke. The crowd chuckled. A few snickers turned into laughter. His son's face had gone pale under his cap, his steps faltering as if the entire weight of centuries of shame had been strapped to his back. Malcolm sat there, every nerve screaming to stand up, to roar back at them, to demand dignity not just for his boy, but for every ancestor who had endured worse. But he didn't. He couldn't, not yet. His wife's hand pressed down on his, her trembling fingers whispering, "Stay calm." And so he swallowed the humiliation like poison, smiling tight, clapping steady, as if he hadn't just been reduced to nothing more than a punchline. Yet inside, something shifted. It was not the kind of wound that bleeds, but the kind that burns slow, etching its vow deep into the marrow. Never again. That night, his son locked himself in his room. The muffled sound of sobbing leaked through the door, and Malcolm stood on the other side, hand pressed flat against the wood, feeling the shame seep into him. Shame for not protecting his son. Shame for thinking money, respectability, and endless hours of building his company would shield his family. He whispered through the door, "Son, they laugh because they're afraid. Remember that. They laugh when they see something stronger than them, even if they don't understand it yet." But the door remained closed. In the days that followed, Malcolm wore his humiliation like an invisible shroud. The world looked the same, but every interaction carried a sharper edge. The white banker who pretended not to recognize him, the restaurant where his table was always not ready yet, the casual comments at networking events suddenly, all of it landed harder, sharper, as though the graduation had stripped away the last illusion. For years he had believed that success could purchase a safe distance from racism, that a nice suit and a fat bank account could build him a fortress. But racism had walked right into that auditorium, sat down next to him, and reminded him with cruel laughter that no such fortress existed. He could have chosen bitterness. Many men did. But Malcolm Green was not built for surrender. He had built a company from scratch with nothing but grit and vision. He had stared down bankruptcy, betrayal, sleepless nights. He understood that power was never given, it had to be taken. And so, instead of drowning in humiliation, he began plotting. Quietly, patiently. The first seed of vengeance sprouted during a dinner with Councilman Harris, a smug career politician who had once courted Malcolm's donations. Over wine, Harris let slip a few truths. The council was divided, elections were coming, and the old guard was weaker than it looked. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, the golden chandelier light glinting off his watch, and for the first time since that graduation, he smiled not with pride, but with purpose. Weeks turned into months, and Malcolm moved like a shadow across the city. He began attending community meetings, listening more than speaking. He funded after-school programs, not for publicity, but for presence. He shook hands, remembered names, and when he spoke, people listened. He wasn't preaching revenge, he was preaching dignity. Justice. A city where a black child could walk across a stage and not be mocked for existing. And slowly, like a tide rising at midnight, his influence spread. By the time the election came, whispers of Malcolm Green's name were everywhere. He had funded campaigns, rallied communities, and cut deals so quietly the old guard never saw him coming. When the results rolled in, it wasn't just a victory, it was a takeover. Malcolm Green, the man they had laughed at, the man they had tried to humiliate, now controlled the balance of power in the city council. But Malcolm didn't celebrate. Not yet. He thought back to that auditorium, the golden light, the laughter. He thought of his son's downcast eyes. And he knew this was only the beginning. The first council meeting Malcolm attended after the election was nothing like the sleek boardrooms he was used to. The chamber smelled faintly of old wood and older grudges, with its arched ceilings and faded flags. The air itself seemed heavy with history, as though every slight and deal and betrayal lingered in the walls. Malcolm sat at the long, polished table, his tailored suit crisp, his golden tie gleaming beneath the lights. Across from him, Councilman Whitmore, a relic of the old guard with skin pale as parchment and eyes that scanned Malcolm like he was an intruder. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, lips curling. "I never thought I'd see the day," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. A couple of chuckles rippled down the table. The room felt the same as that graduation stage, the same laughter, the same subtle knives. But this time, Malcolm didn't flinch. He smiled, slow and deliberate, and said, "Get used to it." The words hung in the air like a blade. Conversations shifted, eyes flicked, and Malcolm knew this was not a room where respect was offered. It was a room where respect had to be taken and welded into permanence. Behind the scenes, his rise had not been clean. Deals had been made in smoke-filled kitchens and crowded barbershops where men trusted only what was said face to face. Ministers had prayed with him, mothers had cried into his shoulder about sons lost to police violence, and Malcolm had listened, really listened, until he knew the pulse of the people better than anyone else in that chamber. He wasn't just a businessman anymore, was becoming the voice of a city that had been ignored, mocked, and broken. But power attracts enemies the way honey attracts flies. Harris, the same councilman who had once loosened his tongue over wine, now looked at Malcolm with a mix of fear and regret. Harris had assumed Malcolm would be a donor, a background player, someone to grease the wheels of politics, but never touch the steering wheel. Instead, Malcolm had grabbed the whole engine. The whispers began almost immediately. "He's too ambitious. He doesn't understand politics. He's only here to line his pockets." Every rumor was sharpened to cut him down. The first real test came with the housing bill. For years, low-income black families had been shoved out of their neighborhoods by predatory developers. The bill on the table promised rent control, funding for affordable housing, and strict penalties for landlords who exploited tenants. Malcolm knew passing it would be war. Developers were some of the biggest donors in the city. But he also knew that if he didn't fight for this, he was no better than the men who had laughed at him. The night before the vote, Malcolm stood before a packed church, the wooden pews creaking under the weight of hundreds of people. The air was hot, heavy with sweat and expectation. He didn't use a microphone. He didn't need one. His voice carried, deep and unshakable. "They told me I didn't belong in that auditorium," he began, his eyes sweeping the crowd. "They told my son his name wasn't worth saying right. They laughed at us. And I realized something. They laugh because they believe this city is theirs. But I tell you tonight it belongs to you. To us. To every child who deserves to grow up without fear of losing their home. Tomorrow they will try to tell you again that you don't belong. But tomorrow we will show them we do." The church erupted, the sound echoing like thunder through stained glass windows. Malcolm felt it deep in his chest, the hum of a people rising. The next day, the chamber was chaos. Developers had bought votes, promises had been exchanged, and still Malcolm stood tall. The bill passed by a single vote. 1. The chamber erupted in protest, Whitmore pounding his fist against the table. Harris hissed threats under his breath. Malcolm only smiled, because he knew that single vote meant something far greater than legislation. It meant the city council could no longer ignore him. But victories in politics are never free. A week later, Malcolm's office was vandalized, the glass shattered, walls tagged with slurs he hadn't seen since childhood. His son, now studying at university, called him in panic. "Dad, maybe you should slow down. Maybe you're pushing too hard." Malcolm listened, heart aching at the fear in his boy's voice. But he answered with steady calm. "Son, they want me to stop. That's why I can't." The deeper he pushed, the more brutal the backlash. Anonymous letters, veiled threats, deals withdrawn. But every attack only sharpened his resolve. He had learned something at that graduation. Humiliation could be fuel if you knew how to burn it. And Malcolm Green was burning. Months stretched on, and the tide began to turn. Where once his name was spoken with ridicule, now it was spoken with respect, even fear. The press, once dismissive, started calling him the rising power broker. Young activists painted murals of him, golden light haloing his image. Yet Malcolm never let himself forget the sound of laughter in that auditorium. Every night it echoed in his head, not as torment, but as reminder. Still, the higher he climbed, the more dangerous the game became. Harris betrayed him outright, siding with developers on a new zoning deal. Whitmore tried to smear him in the press, digging into his company's finances, even spreading rumors about affairs. Malcolm met each attack with steel. He released his company's records publicly, exposing not only his own books, but also the tangled corruption of half the council. The headlines were brutal for everyone but him. The pressure mounted. On the night of another key vote, Malcolm walked alone through the city, the streets lit in the golden glow of street lamps. He passed shuttered shops, graffiti-scrawled walls, kids huddled on stoops. This was the city they wanted him to give up on. This was the city they thought could never belong to him. And yet here he was, its heartbeat echoing with his footsteps. He whispered to himself, "You will never laugh at my son again." When he entered the council chamber the next day, he no longer felt like an intruder. He felt like gravity itself, pulling everything toward him. The vote passed by a landslide, not because the old guard wanted it, but because they realized resisting him was useless. Power had shifted, irrevocably, but Malcolm wasn't finished. He didn't just want bills passed. He wanted change written into the bones of the city. Schools, policing, representation. Each fight grew harder, but with every victory, the laughter of that graduation grew fainter, replaced by something else. Respect, grudging but undeniable. And yet, deep down, he wondered, was he building a future for his son, or just teaching him that power was the only shield? He thought of the closed bedroom door, of his boy's sobs, of the weight he still carried. He had seized control of the council. But could he heal the wound of that day? The night the threats reached his doorstep, Malcolm realized the war had left the chamber and entered his home. It was a Tuesday, quiet, the kind of evening when the city exhaled after a long day. He was sipping tea in his study when his wife screamed from the porch. He ran outside to find a cross, crudely hammered together, smoldering in the yard. The fire licked the night sky in streaks of orange and gold, the smoke curling like the laughter that had once suffocated him in that auditorium. His son, home from college for the weekend, stood frozen in the doorway, the flames reflected in his eyes. It was a reminder, vicious and deliberate: you will never belong. The police came, shaking their heads, muttering about probably kids and not much to go on. Malcolm said nothing. He didn't trust them to protect him. Instead, he called his allies. Ministers, activists, neighbors. They gathered that night on his lawn, dousing the fire, standing guard until dawn. For the first time, Malcolm saw what his fight had become. It wasn't just his war anymore. It was theirs. But inside the house, his son trembled. "Dad, why do you let them do this to us?" His voice cracked with rage. "You could leave. You could take us somewhere safe. You have the money. You don't have to stay here." Malcolm put his hands on his son's shoulders, the weight of generations pressing into his grip. "If I leave, they win. And then one day you'll be standing where I am now, and they'll laugh at you the way they laughed at me. I fight so you won't have to." His son turned away, tears sliding down his face, but Malcolm knew the words had landed somewhere deep, like seeds waiting for the right season. The next morning, the city woke to headlines. Black leaders home targeted. Pictures of the burned cross spread like wildfire. The old guard had intended to scare him, but instead they gave him a weapon. Crowds filled the streets, marching, chanting his name. What was once humiliation had become firepower. The council chamber buzzed with unease. Whitmore slammed his fist down during a closed session. "This has gone too far. He's turning every incident into a circus. He's not here to serve, he is here to rule." But even Whitmore's allies shifted uncomfortably. No one said it out loud, but they all knew the truth. Malcolm wasn't manufacturing anything. The city was speaking, louder than it ever had, and he was the only one listening. Yet victory always exacts its price. Malcolm's company began to falter. Investors pulled out, whispering that he was too controversial. Contracts dissolved overnight. His once proud empire shrank until only the skeleton remained. His wife worried. "Malcolm, you're losing everything we built." He looked at her, exhaustion carved into his face, and said, "We're not losing. We're trading. Brick for brick, dollar for dollar, until dignity is paid in full." The breaking point came with the police reform bill. It was the most explosive legislation yet demanding accountability, independent investigations, body cameras. The unions were furious, the mayor opposed, and threats poured in like rain. Malcolm knew this was the battle that would define him. If he lost, everything else would unravel. If he won, the city would never be the same. The night before the vote, he couldn't sleep. He walked the empty halls of his home, past family photos, past the graduation picture of his son. In that picture, his boy was smiling, but Malcolm saw beyond his trembling lips, the eyes that had fought tears. He stopped in front of the frame, touched the glass, and whispered, "Tomorrow I will end it." The chamber was standing room only. Protesters packed the gallery, their chants echoing through the marble. Cameras lined the back wall. Every council member knew the world was watching. Whitmore rose first, railing about law and order, painting Malcolm as a dangerous radical. Harris followed, his words slick with false concern. "We all want justice, but this goes too far." When it was Malcolm's turn, he didn't raise his voice. He spoke low, steady, forcing the chamber into silence. "I remember the night they mocked my son. I remember the laughter that told me we didn't belong. That night I made a vow that no father, no mother, no child would ever feel that humiliation in this city again. You talk about law and order, but order without justice is nothing but control. Law without fairness is nothing but chains. Tonight, you choose. You can stand with fear, or you can stand with the people you swore to serve." The vote was called. One by one, names were read. Yes. No. Yes. No. The tension mounted with every word. And then, the final tally passed. By 2 votes. The gallery exploded. Tears, cheers, fists in the air. Malcolm closed his eyes, the sound washing over him. He thought of the burned cross, of the shattered glass, of his son's sobs. All of it had led here. He had not just passed a bill. He had broken the laughter. But even in triumph, the battle scarred him. His company was gone. His fortune dwindled. The stress carved lines into his face, stole hours of sleep he would never get back. Yet when he returned home that night, his son was waiting at the table. No cap, no gown, no shame. Just a young man looking at his father with new eyes. "Dad," he said softly, "they don't laugh anymore." Malcolm sat down across from him, the golden light of the kitchen lamp pooling between them. For the first time in years, he felt the laughter fade completely, replaced by something stronger, brighter. Not revenge, not even victory, but dignity, finally, made real. The morning after the reform bill passed, the city felt different. The air seemed lighter, the sun brighter, the golden light spilling across rooftops as if the city itself had exhaled. Crowds gathered outside Malcolm's office, not to protest, but to celebrate. Strangers shook his hand. Mothers pressed their babies into his arms as though he carried luck itself, and teenagers shouted his name like he was already legend. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to feel it, the weight of change. But legends are fragile things. The mayor, bruised and humiliated, announced he would veto the bill. It was a desperate move, one meant to remind the city that power still rested in the old structures. The council chamber erupted in outrage. Reporters hounded Malcolm for comment. "What will you do now? Is this the end of your reform?" He answered with calm steel, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." He knew what had to be done. If the mayor blocked the will of the people would have to choose a new mayor. Whispers became strategy, strategy became movement, and before long, a campaign was born not for Malcolm himself, but for someone he trusted. He refused to be mayor. He didn't want the chains of the office. But he knew how to build power, and he knew how to hand it to the right hands. Meanwhile, his personal life carried the quiet scars of battle. His wife moved like a woman both proud and weary, her eyes shadowed by the toll of long nights and relentless fear. His son, now interning at a legal aid clinic, grew sharper, angrier, more impatient with injustice. "You gave me an example, Dad," he said one night, his voice fierce. "But it's not enough. I want more than dignity. I want justice, real justice, for everyone." Malcolm looked at him, the fire in his son's eyes, and felt both pride and worry. The fight was in his blood now. The legacy had taken root. The months that followed were a blur of rallies, meetings, and battles in the press. The city became a battlefield of words and visions. The old guard painted Malcolm as a puppet master, a dangerous radical pulling strings. But the people saw through it. They remembered the cross in his yard, the reforms he had won, the dignity he had demanded. When election day arrived, the turnout shattered records. And when the results came in, The mayor was swept out, replaced by a candidate who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Malcolm from the beginning. It was not Malcolm's name on the ballot, but everyone knew whose hand had guided the victory. For the first time in the city's history, the council and the mayor's office were aligned under a vision of equity and justice. For the first time, the laughter of mockery was gone, replaced by the hum of possibility. On the night of the inauguration, Malcolm stood in the crowd with his family. Golden lights bathed the stage, the new mayor's voice rising with hope. His son stood beside him, taller now, more confident, his eyes no longer burdened by shame. Malcolm felt his wife's hand slip into his, her grip steady, her smile soft. For a moment, he let the crowd's cheers wash over him, not as validation but as vindication. The humiliation of that graduation night had been rewritten into triumph. Yet Malcolm knew power was temporary. Laws could change, leaders could fall, victories could fade. What mattered was what endured. And so he turned his focus not just to politics, but to building. He funded scholarships for Black students, opened mentorship programs, created spaces where young people could dream without fear. He poured what was left of his fortune into seeds, believing the harvest would come long after he was gone. One evening, months later, he returned to that same auditorium where it had all begun. The school had invited him to speak at a new graduation. As he stepped onto the stage, memories surged: the laughter, the humiliation, the vow. But this time, the seats were filled with faces looking at him with respect, even awe. He spotted his son in the audience, arms crossed, a proud grin tugging at his lips. Malcolm cleared his throat, his voice steady. "Years ago, I sat where you sit now. I watched my son walk this stage, and I watched as his name was turned into a joke. That night, I carried a wound that nearly broke me. But here's what I learned. Wounds can be turned into weapons, pain into power. And dignity, your dignity cannot be taken unless you give it away. Remember that as you leave here tonight. Remember that this city, this country, this world will try to laugh at you. But your answer must not be shame. Your answer must be to stand taller." The crowd rose to its feet, applause rolling like thunder. Students cheered, parents wept, and Malcolm felt something he had not felt since before that night so long ago. Peace. When the ceremony ended, he walked outside into the evening air. The sun was setting, casting the city in a golden glow. His son joined him, slipping an arm around his shoulders. "You did it, Dad," he said softly. Malcolm shook his head, smiling. "No, son. We did it. And now it's your turn." They stood there together, father and son, bathed in light, the echoes of laughter finally silenced not by vengeance, but by victory, dignity, and the unshakable truth that they belonged. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.